Good morning, everyone. My name is Natalia Oboznenko. I'm an academic director of UCU Business School, and I'm happy to present our visiting professor Dave Snowden today here at Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, Ukraine. Professor Dave Snowden is an expert in complexity theory, and he is the founder of Kinevan company and the center, and also he is an originator of SenseMaker research tool. And also, Professor Dave Snowden used to work in the industry, in IT sector, and he used to be strategic director at IBM. And today we want to talk a little bit about complexity theory, decision making in the context of organizations or states and countries. And I'm welcoming Professor Dave Snowden, and maybe we can start.
Pleasure to be here again.
Thank you for coming here, because it's always a pleasure to have foreign professors in person on campus, because due to our situation, not all of our professors are ready to come in person. And you spent 4 days in Lviv, and 2 days you used to be a professor for our students. And maybe you can start with your impression about this cooperation, about the questions our students raised, and how it was to work with our students.
It's always been interesting, and I've taught once before. I think the current situation in Ukraine is probably making people more interested and aware of complexity. It's no longer an academic thing. So yesterday I had a meeting with people in the military environment, and that was a serious set of conversations. But so I think when people live under conditions of uncertainty, they start to understand that the science of uncertainty has value. And so the questions become both more finely tuned on the theory, but also more pragmatic. It's kind of like, well, so what should we do? So that's probably a change since I was last year.
Yeah, but your main topic is complexity, and maybe not to disappoint all listeners, all our audience, because complexity is complex, and we don't like complexity, yeah, as a human. But maybe what is your approach to understand, to embrace complexity?
Actually, I think we quite like complexity. We live our day-to-day lives by it. It's how we manage our children and our friends. But probably the key distinction is to make a difference between an ordered system and a complex system. So in an ordered system, there's a very high level of constraint, so everything is predictable, and there isn't any complexity. It's been eliminated. So for example, in the United Kingdom, we drive on the left-hand side of the road. In Ukraine, you drive on the right-hand side of the road. That's a constraint. It's not a universal constraint. If a child runs in front of you, you'll do something different. But fundamentally, that order creates a level of certainty, and it reduces the energy cost of decision making. And that's valuable. The more we can do it, the better. The trouble is that once the number of variables goes up, and once the number of interactions goes up, it starts to become very difficult to take an ordered approach. And another definition of a complex system is it's entangled. So if I go, for example, to the origin of the word complicated, which is a type of order, that's from a Latin root word, which means to be folded. And something which can be folded can be unfolded and folded again. Whereas the Greek root word for complex is something which is entangled. And something which is entangled can't be unentangled and tangled again, which means it's at a very high level of what's called path dependency. So you can't start from scratch. You've always got to recognize there's a history, and the history isn't contained in abstract. The history is contained in the actors in the system, in the interactions in the system. So in a complex system, you're really managing patterns. You can never say in a complex system, if I do X, Y will happen. You might be able to say, if I do X, it's more likely that Y will happen, but you can't say that with certainty. And therefore, the way you manage a complex system is very different. You're changing interactions. And I mean, any parent knows this. Interactions matter more than attitudes if you want to change how children behave. So we can change what's playing in the system. We can change how it interacts. And if patterns emerge which we find favorable, we give them more energy. And if patterns emerge that we find unfavorable, we give them less. So it's compatible with order, but it's different. Management is actually quite easy because it's how we manage our families. And it's a recognition of reality. In a complex system, there isn't a linear relationship between cause and effect. So act differently.
Yeah, you said before that you don't give the recipes, the ready-made solutions for any tasks, any problems. But um, what business and organization want from you as an advice or as a consultancy? What the main request from them?
Um, well, let's go on to the metaphor for a minute. So we make a difference between a recipe book user and a chef. So a recipe book user always uses the same ingredients and the same equipment in the same sequence. Whereas a chef can put together different combinations of things and can substitute one thing for the other and adapt to your own context. So what we've seen for the last few decades in management consultancy is a series of recipes, each one of which becomes a management fad for 3 or 4 years. And I've lived through them all: business process reengineering, what Gary Klein calls Six Sigma, which I think is a beautiful name for it. Blue ocean strategy, red ocean, learning organization. And each of these contains some partial aspect of the truth, but it's not complete, but it's sold as a recipe. It's something you do, and you're meant to abandon what you did before. And that drove me when I came out of industry, because everything we'd done before the new thing came in had value. It's just, it wasn't universal. Yeah? So I think the work we do for companies is much more about, first of all, situational assessment. We have techniques like estuarine mapping, which we can do with software, we can do it in workshops, and starting to understand where people are and what they can do next, but also critically understanding what they can't do. So one of the key differences between complexity and systems thinking, which came before, systems thinking tends to define goals and try and closes the gap, which means it misses opportunities in the present. Complexity tries to describe the present as accurately as possible and starts journeys with a general sense of direction. So in working with organizations, we generally deal with what are called intractable problems. Problems is difficult to get a grip on that traditional solutions have failed.
Yeah, but that they are aware that they have the problem. And
Generally, yes. Or they're aware that there are problems and then they don't know what the problems are. So that's one of the meanings of intractable. So, they may have just done a major change initiative, but it hasn't worked, or it's only worked in part, or they're getting the opposite behavior of the one they want. And I think, anything like that, which is that they've been dealing with a complex system as if it was ordered, as if it can be engineered, when actually the metaphor is more like a garden. It has to be grown, it has to be nurtured, and you have to see what works.
yeah, the next very important meaning and notion for universities, for educational institutions, and for the company as well is knowledge. And now we live in a world where information is abundant, and sometimes people think that they have knowledge instead of information, and we are overwhelmed as individuals, as a company, as countries with information, and we can say also with knowledge. And how to deal with that? What is your philosophy?
I think it's actually worse than that. We're overwhelmed with data. Very little of it informs us, which is what information should be seen as what informs us into action. So I think the problem is people have got obsessed with data. It's kind of like, if you know the rhyme of the ancient mariner, water, water everywhere and ne'er a drop to drink. It's like data, data everywhere and no meaning to make, which is why we get this rush to AI, which is actually quite dangerous for human sense making. So I think the danger is we gather data without thinking about meaning. Now, if you look at the way human beings have evolved, we delegate a lot of our decision making to trusted individuals, trusted networks, trusted institutions. We very rarely work with primary data. But now in modern systems, we're expected to work with primary data, and we didn't evolve to do that. We evolved to use social structures. We evolved to use trust as a key determinant. We evolved to use common education. It's a lot more messy than people would make you think. And this phrase I invented some time ago called messy coherence is human beings learn to live in an ambiguous, constantly changing, unstructured environment, but we know how to follow coherent pathways. Yeah, but we don't get rid of the mess, because if we get rid of the mess, we get rid of the innovation, we get rid of the ideas, we get rid of the novelty.
You use different adjectives for the situations, kind of complicated, complex, chaos, chaotic. And how do you describe the situation? I don't know, in Ukraine or
Uh,
generally.
it's a mixture of all of them. The key principle on complexity is to break things down to the point where you know what type of system you do. So Ukraine has got ordered aspects, complex aspects, and occasionally chaotic. Chaos is quite a rare phenomenon. So the secret is not to say, how do you deal with Ukraine? That's too big a problem, but to break it down and start to find different ways of understanding it. Some of the stuff I've been talking about, for example, is in Battlefield, the work we do, which is to gather stories from company commanders in real time, rather than doing an after action review, because you want to switch to more diverse capture. But we're not capturing raw data, we're capturing the commander's interpretation of the situation. So that's trusting the commander to do some of the interpretation. We do the same in companies. We'll present a problem faced by the CEO to the whole workforce. Everybody will interpret that problem, and then we look for patterns interpretation and find people who are seeing the world differently. And we follow that pathway. So the way you manage complexity is different from the way you manage order. In the Cynefin framework, you basically divide order into two, clear and complicated. Clear is the traffic light situation. I do what I'm told, everybody buys into it, nobody disputes it. Complicated, there is a right answer, there is one way to do things, but only the experts will know. And so those are both types of order. They're slightly different. And there you get the difference between best practice and good practice. The chaotic system will only ever arise temporarily, and it will often happen because you over-constrain the system. It breaks, and it breaks catastrophically. Then you have to act decisively to introduce some sort of stability. Yeah? Most of the time we're dealing with complex. In a complex environment, one of the characteristics is there will be multiple hypotheses about what we should do, all of which have some coherence to the facts. So what you do in a complex system is you run a safe to fail experiment for any coherent hypothesis. Probably none of them actually work, but they change the space so you can see what you should actually do. So the action type is different. And by the way, that saves a hell of a lot of executive time, resolves a lot of conflict. I can agree your idea is coherent, even if I disagree with you. And then the fifth domain in Cynefin, which everybody neglects but is the most important, is called the aporetic domain. Now, aporia is a Greek word. It means an unanswerable question. So Derrida famously said this, a French philosopher. If you know the answer to a question, it isn't a question, it's a process. The only valuable questions are the ones to which you don't know the answer, so you have to think or act differently. So in Cynefin, what we try and do is start in that domain. Put people in positions where they can't think the way they've always thought. They've got to think differently. And then some problems will be clear, some will be complicated, some will be complex. And then we deal with those separately and then bring them all back together again.
It sounds like a good approach, pedagogical approach to be used at the universities, at schools.
Quite logical. I mean, my background's physics and philosophy, so yes, I'm likely to produce logical results. I mean, I think actually, I wouldn't say logical, it's more rational. And I think following a recipe which is being developed, say, for America, I mean, let me be clear on this. Most of the management consultancy methods which swing into places like the Ukraine weren't just developed in America, which is a very different culture. They were developed in American manufacturing industry, which is very different as well. So you can't translate them intact, and that's the problem. People are taking solutions from one context, putting them into another. In complexity, we break those solutions down and then recombine them in a different context.
I wanted to ask you about innovation as well, because we are thinking as Ukrainians that we're quite innovative, and maybe because we don't have enough resources, and maybe we are also under pressure. And I heard one of your video on your site about innovation, and you need to have to starvation pressure. Yes, yes, and maybe you can develop a little bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we know on cognitive neuroscience, that people don't think about the subject and, unless there's an anomaly. Now, if you're in a wartime situation, there are lots of anomalies, and it's no coincidence innovation goes up massively in wartime. I mean, some of the stuff you guys have been doing with drones is beyond anything that anybody imagined in scenarios, which, by the way, is a problem with scenario planning. Reality never matches it. So yes, that does it. But we're interested in how do you do innovation without having to have lots of people die as well. It's kind of like transport. You don't want that as a necessary side effect. So we know if you create anomalies, people will see things in different ways. So one of our processes, for example, is to extract capability from a university into what's called high abstraction metadata, and do the same with these industry issues or problems, and then combine the metadata. So we can say, well, that university idea seems to be linked for reasons we don't understand with this problem. So you're managing for serendipitous encounter. So I think, and I've historically divided innovation into what we call incremental innovation, which is improving what we got. And then eureka innovation, which is Archimedes, which is suddenly discovering the novel. And I think what we've been doing is developing processes, which means the novelty is easier to discover, what we sometimes call managing for serendipity.
If we talk about Ukraine in the global map, in the global scale, we are a peripheral country. And you were saying that being peripheral, it's good. Can you explain? Because we are in Lviv, we are peripheral.
I'm Welsh. We've always been peripheral, right? We're the remnants of civilization, the Romano Celts before the Saxons came. I think, I was talking about this with the former head of the civil service in Singapore, and we've had this conversation several times. We think the future is small countries and not big nation states, because the level of cohesion at a nation state level is going down. You can see that in the American elections. So there's no sort of identity as being an American, a MAGA American or a liberal American or whatever. The identity structures are breaking up because the populations are too big. Whereas in a city, people interact with each other. There's human buffering. We talk with each other. Cities that go much above 5 million, or countries which go much above 5 million, start to lose cohesion. So I think small peripheral nations can innovate much faster than big structured nations. They may not have the resource, but they can also take the resource from the bigger nations and find novel ways of doing it. And I think that's one of the things Ukraine needs to do, and within Ukraine, Kiev.
Yeah, but we used to have around 40 million inhabitants in Ukraine. Now we don't know exactly how many we are in Ukraine. But if the country is big, we can take United States or I don't know, Canada, and or even Indonesia. You were mentioning this country. How they need to be more effective.
And I think that's the problem, because the identity, there are just too many people. Yeah, and also, we're entering periods where there's less resource available, and you get some crazy historical structures growth. So, for example, America actually spends more per head of population on healthcare than any European country, but it doesn't give free at the point of entry healthcare. A different type of system has evolved there, and people are for that or they're against it, right? The narrative patterns which grew up around Trump, which in academic terms we call an assemblage, arguing against those from a different ideological background rationally and logically makes them worse, not better. So what happens when populations grow is ideologies grow, and ideologies create attractor worlds, and people get swept up in them. And you lose the intimacy of day-to-day contact, and the internet has made that worse. A friend of mine in the mountains, in Canada, once said, used to be every village had an idiot, and it didn't matter because everybody knew who the idiot was. But now the idiots have banded together on the internet to legitimate idiocy. So one of the things we've lost in internet-mediated large society is human interaction at scale. So a lot of our work is how do we increase that by using young people as ethnographers, by bringing people together from different backgrounds around common tasks. So increasing empathetic context, so people see people as people, not as part of a myth or ideological structure.
Yeah, it's more easy to say than to do.
It is, although we manage it in our families, and human beings do change if they interact with each other outside a wartime situation. But you're dealing with a dominant ideology in Putin's concept of Rus, for example. It's not there's a difference between, say, Trump's transactionalism and Putin's ideology. And starting to understand those different motivations is key. You can negotiate with somebody if it's a transactional relationship. If it's ideological, that's far more difficult. And I think one of the things complexity does is to start to help you understand these things and understand that the intervention which works here won't work there and vice versa.
But if we come back to organizations and decision making and strategy development, you presented during the course for our students several frameworks and tools. And what do you advise to do at the daily
The
basis?
fundamental thing is to start to understand where you are, not where you would like to be. In a complex system, you can't predict the future anyway. And we see this with, for example, explicit targets. They produce perverse incentives to achieve the target, even if it's not the right thing. So one of the big switches on complexity is to describe the present. So we do that with affordance mapping, we do it with assemblers mapping, we do it with Cynefin. It's all about where am I and what can I do next? We sometimes summarize this as the Frozen 2 strategy. Have you ever seen the film Frozen 2? Okay, Frozen 2 is great. Frozen 2 is a great complexity movie. So you've got this, and in the middle of Frozen 2, the real heroine of the series is the young sister without the magic, not the older sister. She sings this beautiful song, which was subsequently made famous by a Ukrainian refugee, which is all I can do is the next right thing. Well, that's complexity. Now, I'm facing high levels of uncertainty, but I can identify where I should go next and look again. And that's the big switch. So and actually that's how people managed until the 1980s. I mean, that was scientific management, which was actually far more adaptive than systems thinking. Systems thinking got dominated by engineers. And the idea, well, you have to have a plan, you have to have a goal, you manage uncertainty by defining purpose or mission statement or deep purpose or wherever the current jargon is. Yeah. And the reality is it isn't like that. The reality is understand the present, see where you can go next, look again, have a sense of direction, but not a goal.
It sounds like big organizations or medium-sized organizations should live and operate as a family, as a household.
To a degree, yes. All right. And if you look at it, up until the 80s, generally the senior management of a company grew up in that company. So they knew how it worked. And I had the privilege of teaching leadership with Peter Drucker, and both of us said that was actually a good model. Occasionally you brought in somebody outside, but that doesn't happen anymore. What you now get is somebody does a BA followed by an MBA. And to be quite, I don't think you should do an MBA until you've got 10 years of experience anyway. And then they go into a big consultancy and they write reports. And then they move sideways into management without any experience whatsoever. And so they start to manage by figures and reports rather than by knowledge. There's an interesting difference here in the UK hospital, for example. If you meet the management of the hospital, you very rarely meet anybody medical. You'll meet a professional manager surrounded by assistants. In American hospitals, although they have an insurance problem, whenever you went in there, you met a doctor who was in charge of the hospital. And they knew enough. They were called Cullies after the Doctor House series. So they knew enough. They weren't the best doctors, but they did understand medicine and they were good administrators. And that's one of the things you can see in the sort of pre-scientific management periods, systems thinking period, is that the assumption is you have to grow up in an environment, you know things, you know people, you know how it works. Knowledge is not something explicit in a set of spreadsheets, and human judgment counts. Now, what happened in the 80s and 90s is progressively human judgment was removed from system. It was management by spreadsheets. So there are models we can go back to which are not family models, and there are models we can move on to. But we need to change the metaphor from an engineering metaphor to an ecological metaphor.
And maybe your thoughts also will be interesting to understand what do you think about leader? Can we train them? Is it a profession?
Yes and no. I mean, leadership is a distributed function anyway. You'll see natural leaders in most organizations. When I ran leadership development for IBM, we dumped a lot of senior leaders as cleaners in community centers in rough areas of New York for a few days and told them to find out people who'd been leaders without the benefit of their education. And they said that was the most valuable bit of the whole program. Because they realized it was a much more complex thing than they'd done. We didn't evolve to make decisions as individuals. We evolved to make decisions in sexual pairs, what are called work groups, which are normally about 5 deans at about 30, macro deans, etc. If you look at really good leaders, they take people with them from job to job who match their weaknesses. Really good leaders actually operate as what's called a crew. They have people around them who support them. And I think we need to start to make that more formal. Stop trying to focus on inner development and the individual leader. Focus on the leader, the leader's interactions, their ability to manage people from different backgrounds. So there may be a coordinator. If you want a metaphor for this, aircraft have a set of standard roles. There's always a pilot, but the pilot can change.
Because there are standards and
Standard roles,
instructions.
standard interactions. If you look at it, military, civil, all medicine, all of these things work on role-based decision making. They don't do individuals. The individual leader is a very American myth structure. You don't see it, and certainly in Catholic countries. I mean, it's the emphasis on the individual is a very Northern European, North American concept. The emphasis on people's engagement with other people in society is much more Southern, Eastern European, African Asian, and that's probably more sustainable.
Yeah, a lot of things we need to understand, to embrace, and we need to study a lot, and what we are doing exactly at the university, and what is the role of the universities? You will talk later, like during the lecture, but maybe in short.
Very obviously, it's higher education. Yeah, and that's to learn your field, to understand it. And I think we're not doing that well on that because students are not consumers of education. The university is there to educate society. So the students scoring professors is becoming more and more of a problem. It's creating a homogeneity within the system. So there is that role about how do you advance the field, how do you deal with it. I think the thing which is neglected, partly because of a breakdown of things like common rooms and a breakdown of joint degrees, which people don't do anymore, is to bring together different disciplines. And I think that's something which needs to be brought back. I think also that other aspects of universities which are very esoteric, there's also the need to entangle more into society. But it's worth remembering, and this is a problem for governments, by the way, if I go back, Max Brasso did this work in the UK. He identified most of the UK and the economy on the 60s and 70s was coming from what had been considered pure science research of no practical benefit whatsoever in the 40s and 50s. And that's the trouble, this idea that universities have to produce something which produces an economic benefit within 2 or 3 years is a consumer-based transactional model of education. At the same time, when I went to university, 5% of the population went. So the country could afford to fully fund you, so you had the time to be educated. And I think we got that balance wrong. I was in Oxford College the other day with Lord Allardyce and other people. And one of the points that they made is if you were good at your subject, you could live in the college. Your food was provided, basic education, accommodation was there. You were never going to be super rich. But the assumption was it was almost monastic. You just wanted to pursue your subject. And I think we've lost that bit. In the humanities, the pure sciences, you need a small amount, which is research and thinking for its own sake without knowledge of practical benefit. And the other big mistake I think we made in the UK is we made polytechnics into universities. Well, the polytechnic sector was designed to interact between education and industry. So we need to realize those are different functions.
Yeah, indeed. And actually, I know that we can talk longer hours because the subject is very big and very immense, big. And but I want to stop here because we will have a lecture this afternoon, and actually we hope to have you as a visiting professor next time because it's better to come to the university, to the class and have this 2 days or even much more to think and to work together, as you said, in interaction with other people. And thank you for coming, and thank you for this first experience within business school. And I hope you like it as well, and you will come.
It's good to be here again, and thank you for looking after me.
Thank you. Thank you.